September 1978. London. For 6 weeks, Led Zeppelin gathered in a rehearsal space, attempting to write songs for their 8th studio album, but something was fundamentally broken. Jimmy Page, the architect of Led Zeppelin's sound, the man whose guitar had defined a generation of rock music, would arrive hours late, or not at all. When he did show up, he was skeletal, pale, barely able to hold his guitar. His heroin addiction, which had begun around 1975, had transformed him from a commanding presence into a ghost haunting his own band. John Bonham, whose thunderous drums had provided the heartbeat of songs like When the Levee Breaks and Kashmir, was drowning in alcohol. He'd show up drunk or stay away entirely. The man who could make a drum kit sound like an army was losing the war against his own demons. This left Robert Plant and John Paul Jones staring at each other across an empty room, wondering if Led Zeppelin would survive to make another album. Jones later described it bluntly. There were two distinct camps by then, and we were in the relatively clean one. It was an astonishing reversal. For years, Page had been the leader, the visionary who heard complete arrangements in his head and guided every note. But now the band's most underrated member, the quiet bassist who'd been a session musician before Zeppelin, would have to step forward. Jones had recently purchased a Yamaha GX1 synthesizer, a massive, expensive instrument that could replicate entire orchestras. He'd been experimenting with it, discovering sounds that had nothing to do with Zeppelin's blues rock foundation. Plant, still grieving the death of his 5-year-old son Karak in 1977, needed music to be his salvation, not his destruction. He'd seriously considered walking away from rock entirely, becoming a teacher, living a normal life. But here he was, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. During those 6 weeks, a pattern emerged. Jones and Plant would work during the day, building songs from keyboards and vocals. Page and Bonham would stumble in at night, adding their parts if they were capable. It was hardly the collaborative process that had created Stairway to Heaven or Kashmir, but it was all they had. After 6 weeks of this fractured preparation, manager Peter Grant made arrangements for them to fly to Stockholm. Not London, not New York, Stockholm, Sweden. To ABBA's Polar Studios, a facility built by the biggest pop group in the world. The title they'd chosen for the album said everything. In Through the Outdoor. Moving in the wrong direction. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us keep telling these stories that deserve to be heard. November 1978. ABBA's Polar Studios sat in Stockholm, a state-of-the-art facility where 4 Swedish pop musicians had recorded some of the catchiest songs of the decade. Now, the greatest hard rock band in history would attempt to make their 8th album in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. That's all they'd budgeted. Previous Zeppelin albums had taken months. Led Zeppelin by 4 had required multiple locations and endless perfectionism from Page. But in 1978, with the band barely functional, they'd have to work fast or not at all. Jones arrived first every morning, often alone. He'd set up his synthesizers, program drum machines, lay down keyboard parts. The studio engineers watched him essentially write arrangements by himself, something unthinkable in classic Zeppelin. Plant would join him, and together they'd construct the bones of songs. Southbound Sores emerged from Jones's rollicking piano introduction, capturing a New Orleans barroom atmosphere. Plant wrote lyrics about movement, about escape, about trying to outrun grief. These sessions had an unusual intimacy. Jones and Plant, who'd rarely written together in the past, were discovering a creative partnership. Without Page's dominating guitar presence, Jones's keyboards moved to the foreground. The synthesizer became the lead instrument on several tracks, revolutionary for Led Zeppelin, heresy to some fans. Late at night, Page would arrive. Sometimes coherent, sometimes not. The guitar parts he added were often brilliant. He was still Jimmy Page after all. but they were fragments rather than the elaborate compositions he'd once crafted. Bonham's attendance was equally erratic. When he played, his technique remained impeccable, but the fire seemed diminished. For the first time in Led Zeppelin's history, Bonham would receive no songwriting credits on an album. He was simply too absent, too lost in his own struggle. The division created something unprecedented. For the first time ever, two Led Zeppelin songs, Southbound Saurez and All My Love, carried no writing credit for Jimmy Page. This was a band that had always been a four-headed creative monster, and now its leader had been reduced to a contributor. Jones found himself producing in ways he never had before. He'd layer synthesizer strings, add Baroque horn arrangements from the Yamaha GX1, create soundscapes that owed more to progressive rock than blues. Plant, watching his band disintegrate, poured his grief into the lyrics. Every song became about loss, about searching, about trying to hold on to something as it slipped away. In just 3 weeks, they'd recorded 7 songs. Not the double albums of their prime, not the sprawling experimentation of physical graffiti. 7 songs. But those 7 songs would end up saving more than just Led Zeppelin. After the recording sessions ended, Page took the tapes to his personal studio at his home in Plumpton to mix them. Even in his diminished state, he understood sound, understood how to make a record breathe. The mixing took months, but eventually they had an album. They just didn't know if anyone would care. Your support means everything. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and help us grow this channel. August 22nd, 1979. Record stores across America received shipments of a Led Zeppelin album wrapped in plain brown paper bags. You couldn't see which cover you were getting. There were 6 different sleeve variations, each showing a different angle of the same scene. A man sitting in a bar, viewed from perspectives labeled A through F. You had to buy it to discover which version you owned. This marketing gimmick perfectly captured the album's themes of mystery, of wrong doors and missed connections. It also created a collector's frenzy. Fans bought multiple copies just to get different covers. The inner sleeve had another trick. It appeared to be in black and white, but when you dampened it with water, colors appeared like magic. It was clever, it was different, and it felt like a goodbye, though no one knew it yet. The album title came from a Chicago bar phrase, meaning to enter through the exit, to go the wrong way. Some speculated it referred to Led Zeppelin's unfashionable status in the punk era. Others thought it described the band entering their final phase through an unexpected doorway. But here's what nobody anticipated: the commercial explosion. In its first week, In Through the Outdoor sold 1.7 million copies, 422,600 in the first 7 days alone. By its second week on the Billboard 200, it hit number 1. Then something extraordinary happened. The success of the new album created such demand for Led Zeppelin's music that Atlantic Records shipped 1 million copies of their back catalog to stores in September 1979. Between late October and early November, Led Zeppelin's entire discography appeared simultaneously on the Billboard 200. All of it, every album, at the same time. They broke their own record, set in 1975, for most albums on the chart at once. In the punk era, when Led Zeppelin was supposedly dead and irrelevant, they dominated the American album charts more completely than ever before. The album stayed at number 1 for 7 weeks. By the end of September 1979, it had sold 3 million copies. Industry analysts credited In Through the Outdoor with helping to revive the struggling U.S. record industry. After years of declining sales and the chaos of the punk explosion, a Led Zeppelin album had stabilized the market. But the critics were divided, sometimes brutally so. Charles M. Young of Rolling Stone went for the throat. Page's diminishing creativity resulted in little good material. Plant's lyrics were inane, and Bonham's drumming was heavy-handed. John Paul Jones, Young wrote, functions best behind Page, not in front of him. Melody Maker's Chris Bone was worse. The first play had everyone in the office rolling around laughing, he wrote, accusing the band of being totally out of touch. In the wake of punk rock, Led Zeppelin had become acceptable targets. They represented everything the new movement opposed: stadium rock, excess, technical virtuosity over raw emotion, elaborate compositions over three-chord fury. But not everyone dismissed it. Some critics heard something brave in the album's departure from Led Zeppelin's signature sound. The synthesizers, the softer textures, the willingness to experiment with samba and rockabilly, these weren't signs of weakness but of a band refusing to repeat themselves. The fans didn't care about critical fashion. They bought the album in staggering numbers. They requested the songs on radio, and when Led Zeppelin announced their return to the stage, the demand was overwhelming. Page would later admit his own reservations about the direction. He told journalists he wouldn't have wanted to pursue this keyboard-heavy sound in the future. He'd been working with Bonham on plans for a harder-driving rock album, something to reclaim Zeppelin's thunder. Plant had different feelings. He called In the Evening a real stomper, and believed All My Love was one of their finest moments. He'd needed these songs, needed this album to process his grief and find his way back to music. Jones, who'd essentially produced the album by default, felt proud of the work. He'd saved Led Zeppelin from collapse, even if the world didn't fully understand his role. Bonham said little publicly. Those who knew him saw a man still struggling, still searching for something the music couldn't provide anymore. The album had strange contradictions. It was their most successful in terms of chart performance, yet many considered it their weakest. It showed musical growth and experimentation, yet Page felt it moved in the wrong direction. It had saved the band financially but couldn't save them personally. And then came Knebworth. August 4th, 1979. Knebworth Park, Hertfordshire, England. For the first time in 4 years, Led Zeppelin would play in the United Kingdom. For the first time in 2 years, they'd play anywhere. Manager Peter Grant decided against a full tour. The operation had become too massive, too unwieldy. Better to make it an event. 2 enormous outdoor shows that would announce their return. The demand for tickets was staggering. Reports claimed 210,000 attended the first show, though these numbers would later become a point of bitter dispute. A second show on August 11th drew an estimated 180,000. But something was off from the beginning. Plant seemed perplexed by the audience's muted response. Between songs, you could practically hear a pin drop in that vast field. Fans stood and stared like witnesses to something they couldn't quite process. This wasn't the hysteria of earlier Zeppelin shows. It felt more like watching a monument than experiencing a living band. The performance was uneven. Moments of brilliance. Kashmir, Stairway to Heaven, the laser pyramid that encased Page during In the Evening, clashed with sluggish pacing and rambling guitar solos. They opened with 2 new songs from In Through the Outdoor, In the Evening and Hot Dog. The crowd didn't know them yet, and the album wouldn't be released until weeks later. Critics attacked them savagely. New Musical Express, Sounds, and other publications called the shows rusty, sluggish, evidence that Led Zeppelin was now obsolete. Plant fired back sarcastically from the stage during the second show, but later admitted his own reservations. Knebworth was useless. It was no good at all. We weren't ready to do it. Grant, always protective of his band, said simply, the performance was a bit rusty. Yet for 200,000 people who attended over those 2 nights, it was the only time they'd ever see Led Zeppelin live. For many, it was their first concert experience ever. For that reason alone, Knebworth holds a special place in the band's history, not as a triumph, but as a final flawed glimpse of rock's greatest band. The financial aftermath was ugly. Promoter Freddie Bannister's company went into liquidation, buried under the costs of the massive production. Disputes over attendance figures and payments created lasting bitterness. Grant claimed far higher attendance numbers than Bannister's ticket receipts showed. The arguments were never fully resolved, but the album kept selling. By the time 1979 ended, In Through the Outdoor had spent more weeks at #1 than any Led Zeppelin album except Led Zeppelin II. They scheduled a North American tour for October 1980. It would be their first American show since 1977, their chance to reclaim their throne. Then, September 25, 1980, changed everything. If you were listening to American radio in January 1980, you kept hearing a Led Zeppelin song that sounded like nothing they'd done before. Fool in the Rain had Latin rhythms, samba breakdowns, a middle section that could have been lifted from Argentine television, and lyrics about a guy waiting on the wrong street corner for a date who never shows up. It peaked at number 21 on the Billboard Hot 100 and hit #1 on the Canadian charts. For a band that had rarely released singles in the US, this was significant. It became their 6th American top 40 hit and would be their last. The song came from Jones and Plant watching the 1978 FIFA World Cup in Argentina. The constant samba beats from television themes stuck in Plant's mind. He told Jones they needed to explore new musical territory to stay relevant. What they created was unique. Bonham playing a halftime shuffle beat similar to Bernard Purdie's famous pattern. Jones adding whistles and timpani crashes. Page's guitar work restrained but effective. The samba breakdown at 2:25 was recorded separately. You can hear Bonham's isolated track switching gears as the song transforms mid-stride. Critics who praised anything about In Through the Outdoor usually pointed to Fool in the Rain as proof the band could still innovate. It was fun, it was unexpected, and it worked. Zeppelin never performed it live. Jones explained that the piano was essential to the song, but with him on piano there'd be no bass. And the guitar parts required switching between a 12-string and Page's regular setup mid-song, while also pulling off the intricate solo. The logistics were too complicated for their massive stage show. Robert Plant would later perform it with Pearl Jam in 2005 at a Hurricane Katrina benefit in Chicago. It was his way of honoring the song's legacy, and perhaps of honoring a band that could no longer exist. In the Evening opened the album with an eerie drone created by Page using a gizmotron, a bizarre mechanical device that used small motor-driven wheels to bow guitar strings, producing sustained synthesizer-like tones. He'd used it before with a violin bow, but the gizmotron was more convenient, if less reliable. The song featured some of Page's most innovative guitar work on the album, even if he was only half present during its creation. The laser pyramid at Knebworth, where green lasers encased him during the guitar solo, became one of the most memorable visual moments of their final UK shows. Rolling Stone called it the album's best track. A classic Zeppelin orchestral guitar rumble halfway between When the Levee Breaks and In the Light. But even admirers noted Plant's vocals were barely understandable. Southbound Sores was pure New Orleans barroom shuffle, credited only to Jones and Plant, the first time Page had been excluded from a Zeppelin song. Jones's rollicking piano drove it, but the song has largely been forgotten, rarely discussed even by devoted fans. Hot Dog was the album's most controversial track, a rockabilly romp that some heard as a fun tribute to Elvis Presley and Ricky Nelson, both major influences on Plant. Others heard it as a joke that didn't land, a country pastiche that betrayed Zeppelin's blues roots. The lyrics about a girl in Texas and lines like, "I took her love at 17, a little late these days it seems," were playful, possibly a gentle jab at Page's own history with younger women. Plant did his best Elvis impression, and Page laid down what would be his last truly inspired guitar solo in a Zeppelin studio. At Knebworth, Hot Dog got the crowd moving, but many fans still consider it the weakest song Zeppelin ever recorded. It's the rare track that divides even hardcore Zeppelin devotees. Carouselambra was a 10-minute epic dominated by Jones's keyboards, covering multiple musical styles and tempos. Page played his double-neck Gibson EDS 1275, but this was Jones's showcase, complex, ambitious, and utterly unlike anything Zeppelin had attempted before. Critics and fans remain split. Some hear adventurous progressive rock, others hear a bloated mess. Then came All My Love. July 26, 1977, New Orleans. Led Zeppelin had just arrived for a show at the Superdome when Robert Plant received a phone call from his wife Maureen. Their 5-year-old son Carac had become severely ill with a stomach infection. 2 hours later, another call. Carac was dead. Plant and Page caught the first flight back to England. The 1977 North American tour was cancelled. Plant withdrew from music, from public life, consumed by grief and guilt. He'd been thousands of miles away when his son died. What kind of father chooses rock and roll over his children? For months, he seriously considered never returning to music. But when Led Zeppelin finally reconvened for In Through the Outdoor, Plant found he needed to write about Carac. He collaborated with Jones on a synthesizer-driven ballad, originally titled The Hook, that would become All My Love. The lyrics are abstract but unmistakable. He is a feather in the wind, all my love to you. Plant recorded his vocal in a single take, his voice raw with emotion. The song changes key on the final chorus, Plant's voice stretching to reach notes that carry his pain. Jones created elaborate string arrangements on the Yamaha GX1, giving the song an almost baroque quality. The synthesizer solo that replaces a traditional guitar solo was unprecedented for Zeppelin, and controversial. Page hated it. I was a little worried about the chorus, Page admitted later. I could just imagine people doing the wave and all of that, and I thought, that is not us, that is not us. Bonham shared Page's reservations. The song was too soft, too pop, too far from what Led Zeppelin was supposed to be. But Plant didn't care. Speaking to journalist Cameron Crowe, he called All My Love one of Led Zeppelin's finest moments. He'd needed this song to survive. It was his tribute to Carac, his way of channeling unbearable grief into something that might offer hope to others who'd lost children. Led Zeppelin performed All My Love during their 1980 European tour. It was one of the most well-received performances, audiences swaying to Jones's synthesizers while Plant sang about the son who would never grow up. Andrew Doskas of Pop Matters later called it the saddest and most heartfelt Zeppelin song, and a fitting ode to Plant's son, which hauntingly enough sounds like a foreshadowing of a band on the path to an impending and unforeseeable dissolution. 1 year after Carac's death, Maureen and Robert had another son. Life continued. But All My Love remains the permanent marker of what was lost. Page's objections to the song's direction were prophetic. It pointed toward a future Zeppelin that he didn't want to exist. Softer, more synthesizer-driven, less guitar-centric. He and Bonham had been discussing plans for the next album. Harder, heavier, a return to their roots. Page even went to see the punk band The Damned to understand where rock was heading, but there would be no next album. September 24, 1980. John Bonham arrived at Jimmy Page's house in Windsor for rehearsals. The North American tour was scheduled to begin October 17th. After 3 years away from America, Led Zeppelin would reclaim their throne. But Bonham was drunk when he arrived. Not unusual, he'd been drinking heavily for years, but on this day he didn't stop. Throughout the day and into the evening, he consumed the equivalent of 40 shots of vodka. Friends and bandmates watched him spiral but didn't intervene. This was Bonzo being Bonzo, they thought. He'd sleep it off. They put him to bed on his side in the recovery position sometime around midnight. The next afternoon, September 25, 1980, John Paul Jones went to check on him. Bonham was dead. He'd asphyxiated on his own vomit during the night. He was 32 years old. Led Zeppelin was over. On December 4, 1980, the band issued a statement. "We wish it to be known that the loss of our dear friend and the deep sense of undivided harmony felt by ourselves and our manager have led us to decide that we could not continue as we were. No replacement drummer, no reunion tours. Led Zeppelin would not exist without John Bonham." The scheduled North American tour was cancelled. In Through the Outdoor remained their final studio album, not by design, but by tragedy. Looking back, the album feels like a document of a band already disintegrating. Page's absence, Bonham's struggle, Plant's grief, Jones holding everything together with keyboards and willpower, it's all there in the music if you know how to listen. The album's title became darkly prophetic. They'd entered through the outdoor, moved in the wrong direction, and found not a new beginning but an ending. In Through the Outdoor has never received the universal praise given to Led Zeppelin IV, or Physical Graffiti. Critics still debate whether it's a brave experiment or a disappointing decline. Fans argue over whether the synthesizers enriched or diminished the Zeppelin sound, but here's what's undeniable. The album saved Led Zeppelin when they should have collapsed. Without Jones's leadership and Plant's determination to continue despite grief, there would have been no eighth album at all. Page and Bonham were too far gone. It sold over 6 million copies in the United States alone, stayed at #1 for 7 weeks, and created such demand that the entire Zeppelin catalog simultaneously charted, an achievement that has never been repeated. It proved that even diminished, even divided, even moving in the wrong direction, Led Zeppelin remained the biggest rock band in the world. The album influenced the 1980s in ways rarely acknowledged. The keyboard-heavy sound, the synthesizer solos, the willingness to incorporate world music elements, these became staples of the decade to come. Genesis, Yes, and other progressive rock bands heard permission in Jones's arrangements. Fool in the Rain showed that samba and rock could merge seamlessly. All My Love demonstrated that synthesizers could carry genuine emotion in a rock context. Even Hot Dog, for all its critics, proved that rockabilly wasn't dead. Most importantly, In Through the Outdoor gave Robert Plant a way to survive the loss of his son. Without All My Love, without this album to pour his grief into, he might never have returned to music. Every solo album Plant has made since, every collaboration, every moment of his continued brilliance, it all traces back to this album that helped him find a reason to sing again. For John Paul Jones, it was vindication. The quiet member, the session musician who'd always served the song rather than seeking glory, had revealed himself as the secret weapon that saved Led Zeppelin. For Jimmy Page, it was a reminder that creativity requires presence. His later work would be more focused, more disciplined, as if he'd learned the cost of absence. For John Bonham, it was the final studio recording of a drumming style that has never been matched. Listen to his work on Fool in the Rain. The grace, the power, the technical perfection, even as his personal life crumbled. It's the sound of a man giving everything to his art, even as he lost everything else. The album didn't change rock music the way Led Zeppelin II or IV did. It didn't establish new genres or create movements, but it did something perhaps more valuable. It showed that even legends are human, that greatness can emerge from dysfunction, that sometimes the wrong direction is the only direction left. When Led Zeppelin walked through the outdoor, they didn't find the exit. They found themselves. Broken, flawed, incapable of continuing, but still capable of creating music that mattered. 7 songs, 3 weeks, 1 final album, and then silence. Thank you for watching this deep dive into Led Zeppelin's final studio album. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who loves music history. These stories need to be told, and your support makes that possible. Until next time.